My name is Joss Calder, and for 11 years on Threll Dock, I scrubbed conduits, swept grav rust off gantry plating, and emptied condensation traps nobody with rank ever looked at twice. I had worn 3 uniforms in my life: Army Green, Merchant Gray, and now the faded brown coverall the Varan Accord issued to dockhands they didn't bother to learn the names of. I was 63 years old. My knees complained on cold mornings, and my left ear still rang faintly from a drive coil flashback 30 years gone. I had made peace, mostly, with being furniture. I knew about the secret, the way the lowest man on any dock always knows. You hear it in the silences. 3 weeks before, the Sky Watchers had confirmed what the Accord scientists had been quietly dreading for a year. Eshvele's sun was going to flare hard inside of 10 days, and there would be no warning beyond what we already had. A whole world, and no fleet big enough to lift more than a fraction of it in time. So they built one ship in secret, fast and ugly and brilliant, meant to slip the first 100,000 souls past the watching eyes of 3 hostile neighbors who would call any evacuation an act of war. They called the effort Hearthlight. Nobody outside command was supposed to say the word out loud, and everybody on the dock said it anyway, low, like a prayer. The ship was called the Sail Mara, and she sat in the deep berth like something asleep that refused to wake. Her drive could fold space well enough on paper. In practice, every time the engineering core lit her core, the resonance chamber answered with a stutter instead of a hum, and the fold collapsed half a second after it opened. 3 days. 3 days of the Accord's finest. Men and women with degrees from 3 systems, instruments that could read a hair's width of metal fatigue from across a hangar, taking that chamber apart and putting it back together, finding nothing wrong, and getting the same stutter every time. The launch window, the one slim hour when the watching neighbor's patrol pattern looked the other way, was closing fast. I heard the duty officers talking about it in the mess like men discussing a death in the family they hadn't told the children about yet. I wasn't part of any of that. I was clearing a jammed maintenance hatch on the lower hull so the real engineers could get back inside the chamber for what felt like the 40th time. And that was the whole of my involvement, as far as anyone planning the evening intended. But I had spent 22 years before this dock keeping old troop transports breathing through worse than a sun flare. Back when the instruments we had were crude and you learned to trust your hands because the readouts lied to you half the time. So when I knelt by that hatch with my old service mallet, the one tool I'd kept through 3 uniforms because a good tool outlives the man who issues it to you, I did what I always did before touching anything I didn't understand. I put my palm flat against the hull plating and I tapped it twice, gentle, the way you'd knock on a door you weren't sure anyone was behind. The plate answered back wrong. Not broken wrong. Quite wrong. A flat, muffled note where there should have been a clean ring. The kind of dead sound I hadn't heard in 3 decades. Not since a gasket seal on an old transport's dampening collar had worn thin enough to swallow vibration instead of carrying it. The new diagnostics wouldn't catch that. They were built to read fractures, heat, charge. Not the simple, stupid fact of a rubber seal gone soft with age, sitting exactly where it would choke a resonance chamber's feedback loop, just enough to turn a hum into a stutter. I should have let it go. It wasn't my hatch to fix, and it wasn't my ship. But I'd spent 11 years being looked through, and there's a particular kind of stubbornness that grows in a man after that long. So I found the duty engineer, a young woman named Iron Sode, hollow-eyed from 3 sleepless days, and I told her, plain, that I thought the trouble wasn't in the chamber at all, but in the dampening collar's seal 2 decks below it, and that I could check in 10 minutes if she'd let me. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger claiming to fix your car with a hairpin. But it was hour 58 of 72, and she was out of better ideas, so she let me through. The seal was exactly where I expected it, and exactly as tired as the sound had told me. Old elastomer gone brittle and thin from decades of thermal cycling nobody had thought to schedule for replacement, because nobody who designed this ship had ever needed to listen to one fail by hand. I didn't have a factory part. I had what I'd always had, a strip of salvaged gasket stock from my own kit, cut to size with a folding knife, and the kind of patience that comes from having fixed worse with less. I seated it, torqued the collar back down by feel, and tapped the plating again. This time it rang true, clean as a bell. Iron Soak called it up the chain before I'd even finished packing my kit. And within the hour, the sail Mara's drive lit on the first try and held. A clean fold, steady as anything I'd ever felt under my hands in my whole life. I was 3 decks down, coiling cable, when Admiral Ashira Voss came looking for the man who'd done it. I'd seen her twice before, always from a distance, a tall, composed woman, a cord pale beneath the dock lights, the kind of bearing that came from carrying a world's worth of decisions and never once setting any of it down where someone could see the weight. She found me with grease still on my hands and asked, without any ceremony at all, whether it was true that a dockhand had done in 10 minutes what her entire engineering corps had failed to do in 3 days. I told her the truth because it was the only thing I had to offer her. I hadn't done anything clever. I just listened to the hull the old way because that was the only way I knew, and it happened to catch what the new instruments were never built to hear. She was quiet a long moment, the kind of quiet that isn't searching for words so much as making room for them. Then she said that Hearthlight would carry her people out within the hour because of what my hands had found, and that she did not intend to let that pass without account, whatever I wanted it to look like. I told her I didn't want a parade. I'd had enough years of being unseen that I'd stopped minding it much, and I wasn't looking to trade that for the opposite kind of attention. All I wanted, if she'd allow it, was to know the ship made it out clean, and maybe, if there was room for an old man with bad knees and a good ear, to keep doing the kind of work I was actually good at, someplace where it mattered enough that people would ask before they assumed it didn't. She didn't offer me a title with weight stitched into it, or a seat at any table I'd have felt foolish sitting at. She offered me a berth on the Sail Mara's own crew roster, ship's engineer, second watch, with my own tools logged under my own name for the first time in 11 years on that dock. She said her corps had the instruments. What they didn't have, and what she intended to keep close from now on, was a man who still knew how to put his hand against a hull and trust what it told him. I said yes before I'd properly thought about it, which is the only kind of yes worth giving. We launched within the hour, 100,000 souls folded out past eyes that never saw us go, to a harbor none of them had ever heard of and would now spend the rest of their lives calling home. I stood near the aft viewport as Eschwelle fell away behind us, smaller and smaller, still whole, still hers a little longer than the Sky Watchers had promised. Nobody cheered. Nobody made a speech. Admiral Voss simply stood beside me at the rail, and for a while neither of us said anything at all, because some things are better held in silence than spoken into something smaller than they are. 11 years I'd gone unseen on that dock, and I'd told myself it didn't matter, because the work still got done whether anyone watched it or not. I still believe that. But I'll admit there's a particular kind of peace in being seen for the right reason, by someone who finally understood that the man with grease on his hands had been carrying something worth listening to the whole time.